Okay, we're going.
All right. Finally, after more than 8 years, we have reached the final section of this course. And we're going to try to move along real rapidly, or quite rapidly. And we're going to try and finish by the end of May, and maybe even by the beginning of May. The final section is on synthesis and summary. And we will introduce those subjects tonight, and will probably be pretty brief. I'm aiming for 45 minutes, but it may run a little over that. Now, both synthesis and summary involve putting together significant components, but the intent of each of them is different. With synthesis, you're trying to generate something new, or you're trying to see something that you couldn't see before except by synthesizing a couple elements together. Jerry guessed it right. The idea is something like an alloy in metallurgy. In metallurgy, what you do is you fuse two metals together. And the product, when you fuse the two metals together, has some of the characteristics of each component. But the result is not just the blend of the other two. The resultant can exhibit characteristics different from either of the two components. And that's the kind of thing that happens with synthesis. Now, just because some things are produced by putting two separate elements together doesn't mean that what is produced is desirable or undesirable. Something like stainless steel as an alloy is quite desirable. There are other alloys that hit the trash bin because they didn't have anything desirable about them. So the hope is in metallurgy that the new characteristics are beneficial and not just something different, or hopefully that they're not something detrimental. Now in astrology, it's not quite like metallurgy. When, as an astrologer, we are synthesizing something, we're not creating something new in the character. We're trying to synthesize things together to see how the original character, the divine being, put them together to what effect. We're not even trying to, or we're trying to avoid reading something into the character because that's an odious thing to do. We're synthesizing, and in the final synthesis, we're trying to find synergies and anti-synergies that were created before the person came to birth. So, the astrologer then uses whatever tool works to produce a synthesis, to produce an intuitive insight into the consciousness of the native. Now, if the native happens to be a not very highly evolved person, synthesis might be fruitless. It's like every other part of astrology. Some charts are just loaded with things because the person behind the chart is very creative, and some are not. It's probably never wise, though, to assume that the person behind the horoscope is a creative dud, because sometimes the spirit within can surprise you even though the person seems like a dud. Now in this course we've already done some synthesis. In fact, there's synthesis in every combination of astrological influences. Like when we've looked at aspect analysis and we see when one planet is stronger than another, something comes out of the combination that doesn't come out if the other planet is stronger than the first. That is a kind of synthesis. It's a way of understanding something that is not just the two components. The best example of synthesis that we've done in this course is at the end of the very first section. When we did all those tests and came up with all those profiles, we dedicated a whole section for each horoscope to cross-profiling. And cross-profiling is a very excellent kind of synthesis. It was quite conjectural, and that's what you want. With synthesis, if you're trying to evoke intuition or give the intuition something to play on, you don't want a form that's really rigid. You don't want to be too assuming about things. Now, when we did that synthesis in the cross-profiling, we were looking at the whole character at large. And now with synthesis in summary, we're looking at the whole character at large again, but it is in a very different way. The difference is that when we first looked at the horoscopes and we held the horoscope at a distance to see if there was a pattern, or we looked at the different elements or things like that, we were looking at broad, vague tendencies that are common to everyone. And we were looking at those generalities in such a way that we could draw something out of them about the generals. Now, what we're doing now, we have looked at all of the main horoscope components. We've analyzed quite a bit. We've gone into detail in a number of things. So the synthesis we do now should be of a much different character. That is, if we're capable of doing any synthesis at all, because at this level synthesis is very, very hard. Synthesis isn't always fruitful. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't. It depends both on the native and it depends on the astrologer. Now, when we did the cross-profiling, we kept an attitude of making it all be tentative or speculative. And the little synthesis that we're going to do now as we look at the charts will be done in the same manner. We're doing that because it's fair to the native to be not too hard set, and it's the most optimal for intuition. Intuition functions best when there is something free-form instead of something that's really tight or really rigid. Now, we're talking about speculation. Speculation is something that in some corners of study is very much disliked. We're going to talk about good speculation. And good speculation is not just saying anything that comes to your mind. In reality, proper speculation is impersonal. And it's a kind of free association about facts that are outside of yourself and that are not just projections from your own being. Obviously, you have to be pretty clear of projections from your own being, or you're going to see things in speculation in other people that may not be in them, and it's very hard to separate the personal projections from what's really there. Now, in order to do good speculation, you have to have familiarity with a lot of things. The spirit has to have something to play on to intuit. It's very much like it is in music. Some people are just purely instrumentalists, and they get the instrument down pat, but they're so perfectionistic about what they're doing that there is no creative interpretation. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who don't know much about music at all, and they do jazz improvisations with no problems at all. But the best kind is when a person knows more and more of the technique and more of the theory of the music and can then improvise and create on that. For many years on campus here, we had an artist in residence who was very famous. His name was Gunnar Johansson, and he could sit down and he could play a 45-minute piano concerto completely improvised. He was so familiar with the concerto form and he was so familiar with music that he could just sit down and do that. Something that a person might spend their entire life working on one piece and not come up with something as beautiful as he could do. And he did this in front of a recorder. There are records that you can get of where he sat down and did concertos live. Bach, he used to improvise 4-part fugues. In fact, he when he did the what is called the musical offering, he improvised the 4-part perpetual fugue. Just, you know, the consciousness that people have to do something like that is really astounding. Some of the things that we want to be familiar with are things that have to do with character. We want to be familiar with psychology and with spiritual studies, because in both of these we're understanding how the human soul works. And the more that we know of psychology and spirituality, the better we will be at synthesizing or doing what we're calling good speculation. Now, I read a lot of Freud and Jung because they help me in understanding a lot of things. Neither of those is a mystic, so some of the things that they say might be psychologically correct, but not ultimately correct because they're not dealing with the whole thing. That's all right. I still benefit, and as I read, I'm reading Jung now just about every day. And even as I'm reading it, there's all kinds of speculative things that come to mind. There is no good book on spiritual psychology. None has been written yet. And until then, we just have to study the rudiments of spiritual things, study a lot of people's lives, and study things like Freud and Jung, and they give us the tools that we need for being speculative. We've said it a number of times that the 3 basic things for understanding astrology or just about everything else in life are observation, intuition, and good judgment. So we're going to have to apply all of those things as we try to synthesize. We're going to have to see what we can come up with. Now we have a lot of knowledge, and we have a lot of knowledge about the people's lives. We're pretty familiar with all of the main components in their horoscopes, and we have plenty to work on for synthesis. Now, we have to be careful with this because our lower natures will try to arrogate to themselves everything that comes from our divine nature or from our individuality. Therefore, when we synthesize, we have to be careful not to fall in love with our own synthesis. All right. Now, synthesis is probably the most difficult part of astrology, and very few people do it. And even try to do it. So we're going to try and reverse that trend and do things differently so that we all get a chance at doing it. Summation is the other intent of this last part. Summation is a process of adding together the components to get a picture of the whole. Not for a new insight, but for a picture of the whole. Now, this is not an easy thing to do for several reasons. The first reason is scope. I don't know of anybody who can grasp the entirety of a human character and not be surprised from time to time. The human character is enormous, and to try to hold the whole of it in your consciousness and get a picture of it the same way that you can put an object in your hand and turn around and look at it from the different points of view, very, very difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to summate because we don't have all of the facts. And we don't have all of the significant facts. The horoscope is a whole because it's a picture of the entire universe, and the individual is a whole, but we don't know everything about an individual. And even the horoscope as a whole is only the part that's manifest in this rebirth. It isn't all remanifest in this birth because we're not big enough to do that yet. All of the elements in astrology do point to significant elements in the human character. Everything that is in the outside universe is in the inside universe, even though it may have a different value inwardly than it does outwardly. Now, this doesn't mean that because everything in the outer universe is also in the inner universe, it doesn't mean that astrology is complete. Now and then we discover a lot of very big differences about the outer universe with astronomy and with astrology. And they have to be assimilated into our collective consciousness. You might say the consciousness of all of humanity. New things have to be studied, and they have to be subjected to intuition and all of those things. And then we have to be careful about the fact of even incorporating new things in astrology, because there is the thing of faddism. A lot of people want to get on the latest new thing and they grab whatever fad is out there. A few years ago it was asteroids, and people were making big statements about character on the basis of asteroids. And I won't say that they don't have some astrological influence, but to make major pronouncements about a person's life and having them be a major part in the character of an individual, it's possible, but not as often as people were doing it. It's also very difficult to get a grasp of the relative significance of the components of character. And in this course, we have been very strong about that. We've developed an estimation system. And through that estimation system, we have an idea of the relative strength of each aspect to each other aspect. And we have an idea of the relative strength of each planet to each other planet, which means we have some idea of the relative strength of a sign to another sign, because what happens to the planets, the signs that they rule are affected in that way. Now, we've looked at this estimation system, and we've looked at people's lives, we've looked at the biographical details and what we know about these people, and for the most part the estimation system is reasonably accurate. It's still an estimation system, and you don't expect too much from it, and we've had very few outright failures. We've used this technical summation to get at the different facets of the character. The personality, the emotionality, the mentality, and the individuality. Again, we've had modest success in judging each of those facets with to see how strong it is or how influential it is on the basis of estimation. And that's about as far as I care to go with it, because if you try to, it takes a much deeper and better kind of knowledge than I possess to very accurately weigh one part of the character against another. We will go a little further with it if we get to an advanced course, which will probably would begin 2 years from now. We'll then look at opportunity quotients, which would be house quotients, and we'll look at designing specific quotients to understand things. Now these are things that are helpful, but I believe that relative to astrology, if astrology is going to continue as being a factor in human cultural evolution, they're only a beginning. I think what will probably happen is that people will become clairvoyant and they won't do as much technical astrology, and they'll try to look at the colors of someone's aura and from that understand in a color way what the character is like and what is stronger and what is not so strong. Even if we don't understand the character comprehensively enough, we have now pretty good appreciation of the strengths and weaknesses and how they affect each other and what overcomes what. Even with that, we'll have a few surprises, just as we've had surprises all along. Now, if we misjudge the relative significance of the components of a horoscope and don't proportion them exactly, what happens is we get a distortion. And the distortion can happen in many ways. There's a very good example from life, if you've ever gone to the carnival and seen the Palace of Mirrors. Every mirror that you look at distorts your body in a different ways. The way you look at yourself, you see various different kinds of exaggerations and diminutions and things like that. Again, when we're trying to do summary, a good solid summary, it is important that we have personal purity. Because if we have favorites, we might stress the things that are favorite to us or things that we're familiar with from our experience more than they are worth. And then our summation or our summary view of someone is likely to be incorrect. What we're trying to say here is that estimation and summary that point at the whole character, this is not a beginner's activity. Not at all a beginner's activity. I'm not sure I'm even going to be able to come up with good summaries. Now, you have to have a good amount of experience. And a good amount of that experience has to be purging one's own character, personal bias. And at the same time, learning to attune one's consciousness to reality and not having a favorite part of reality but your own. Now, it's interesting if you think back about yourself with regard to this course. We've all grown during the course of these talks. Over 8 years, just from the work on the course alone, my astrological understanding has grown appreciably. We're better at understanding people than we were before. This is an ongoing process, and I believe that as spiritual aspirants, that it must be an ongoing process. We must always think of ourselves as getting better, not that we have arrived and that we have gotten there and we are now good. Now, we have to make summation an ongoing process. And this often happens with people that we're familiar with. It's usually our spouses or people that we deal with every day. Our understanding of them as years go by, our total understanding or the summation of their character becomes more and more clear all the time. And you can do the same thing with the horoscope. The more work you put into it, the better your summary is going to be. It is in art, and it is an art in which we improvise, but it is an art in which we also perfect. And while we're talking about art, let's stay with that as a metaphor because it really helps in another way. Suppose you're sketching something, and the thing that you're sketching is something difficult, like a human face. Now, when you sit down to sketch, if you've never done it for a long time or if you've never done it before, one of the first things you realize is you can't draw everything that you see. There's just too much. You see so much, and there's only that much you can put on the paper. And so you have to select. You have to choose what you want to draw. Now, you could do very detailed studies. You could do a big sheet that's just somebody's nose from your own observation, but by the time you got done, you'd have a huge thing that you'd have to see from a distance, and then all of the detail would be lost along the way. So what we're saying here is the same thing happens when we're working with a summary. When we are drawing or when we are composing a summary, we have to choose what things are important to include. And that's an art. What you choose to represent something when you're sketching that's your way of doing it. If we're trying to draw a whole or a picture of a whole, we have to limit ourselves. Now, clearly, if we're drawing someone's face, we look at the most prominent features. Like with me, you'd say, big nose, that has to be there. But sometimes one small feature, when put into a drawing, brings everything else into focus. I did a self-portrait at one time, and as soon as I put this mole in, everything came into focus. And that's one little small thing. It was a significant small thing. So there's something parallel in drawing a summary of a horoscope. You want to stay with the big main features, but you also have to recognize that there are some little things, the moles, so to speak, that bring the big things together so that you can, so that you draw what you draw represents what you're seeing. So you have to train yourself to see things clearly. And seeing things clearly means seeing which things are important, which things are not important. And you also have to develop a skill. You have to develop a motor skill. You have to develop an eye-hand relationship, and you have to have a memory relationship because you can't look and draw at the same time. You can. Some people actually get good at that. And it's the same thing with astrology. You have to develop skills, but the skills are inward skills. Astrological progress is spiritual progress. And the more that we apply ourselves within and develop our inner faculties, the faster we will progress. The more we can put our attention on something in ourself or in someone else's character, the more easily we can describe it. It's very, very hard to describe. Now, focus is especially important if we're sketching. And focus is also important when we are working with astrological summary. Now, what happens is, when we're drawing, we look at what we've done all along the way, almost from the first line on. and we see whether it is well executed or not. If something is misshapen or disproportionate, it becomes obvious right away. You say, no, that's not what I'm seeing. What I've drawn is not what I'm seeing. And we have to learn to do the same kind of thing inwardly. This is what focus and intuition is all about. And trusting the intuition. Behind the horoscope and behind all of the components of the horoscope, behind the mask of personality, there is a unique being. And it has specific characteristics. And even without clairvoyance, it's possible to focus our inward attention on the reality of that being, just as we focus our eye on the object that we are drawing. And when we have made that focus, we intuitively understand whether we have gone awry with our summary or what we have concluded about things. The only difference is that one of these processes is visual and the other is abstract. But they're all equally important. You have to realize when you're looking at a horoscope, you're not looking at a sheet of paper. You are focusing your attention on what that sheet of paper represents. And the more you can focus your inner consciousness on that reality, the better your observations about the character are going to be, and the better your ability to sum up what you see with the inner eye and what you have gotten from your astrological analysis. So, intuitive apperception is what that process is called, looking inward and focusing and so-called perceiving inwardly, can help us with everything in astrology, but it's especially important in summation. This is what we're trying to develop, because if we can't appreciate the character, if we don't know what it is, and then we're not going to get very far with astrology. Astrology is not just learning a bunch of rules and combinations or things like that. Astrology is being able to blend components and things like that, and from that simulate in your consciousness or draw your consciousness to what is actually in the individual you're working with. Now, to assist us in this work is probably the last form you're going to get. You can take about 3 copies if you want for reproduction. And this is what we're going to be using. And we're almost done for the evening already. We might even get it all in 45 minutes. How long have we been going, Jer?
32, 33.
32, yeah. It looks like we are going to get it in 45 minutes. But I can pretty much guarantee you that the ones after this are not going to be 45 minutes. All right. To fill out this chart, we have to assemble all of the important charts that we had before. And those are the profile index, the aspect estimation worksheet, the planet estimation worksheet, the personality fact sheet, the emotionality fact sheet, the mentality fact sheet, and the individuality fact sheet, which I'm sure all of you have right at your fingertips right at this moment.
I'm saving them just for tonight.
Now, all of you also have briefs for each of these fact sheets. Now, if you wanted to, you could just take the titles off of the briefs and string them all together as one thing, and that would be a summation. But it would be a very poor summation. It's what most astrologers and certainly all astrological programs do. They just spew out some things that are there. But when you do that, it lacks the very thing that we've been stressing in this class, and that is perspective, the relative significance, the relative importance, because that's all important. If we don't have that, we're not going to have a real understanding of the character. Now, it's obvious that each of these worksheets and fact sheets is a synthesis in itself. And it points to all of the significant factors. And to some extent, they are itemized. I should say, the more important, like when you look at the fact sheets and you look at the aspects that are involved, it always goes from the most significant to the least significant. So the next thing that you do, before you even put a pencil on this new summary and synthesis chart, is you study each of those 7, or is it 8? 8. You study each of those 8 sheets, and you study it very, very carefully. You ponder it, and you extract what is the most important, the most relatively significant information, and that is what you put into the left column of this sheet. Next time we'll have examples, and you put in what appears to be relevant, whether it's one of those special little things like a mole on the face, or whether it is the outstandingly strong things. It's usually the strongest traits or the most obvious traits or tendencies. When doing that, you don't only look at the strongest things, you look at the weakest also. If somebody is missing something, has no planets in air signs, for example, that's a deficiency. And that has a significance that might be relevant to the individual that makes it such that they can't accomplish the things they would like to do with all of the other things. Again, this is intuitive, and you've got tons and tons of notes now. You've got 8 years worth of notes to look at. And so you look at each one of these sheets, and then you select, and then you take and you put them in here. You want to get a feel for each thing. You want to get a feel for all of the tests and profiles. You want to get a feel for what the mentality is like. And so that it's sort of like you're looking at each component, each of these 8 things that you're going to fill in. You want to synthesize and you want to summarize it so that you have a feel that you can say, this is the most important, and then you put it all together. Now, when you do this, it's a matter of experience. What you're going to get from the handouts from me each time are going to be a result of my experience. What I've learned works and doesn't work. You may see things differently. You may have different experiences. You may go about things in a different way. It's all right. You can fill out the sheet according to the way you do things. I like the idea of the sheet because it really does give a whole picture of a character. No one interpretation or no one interpreter has a corner on what is true or what is not true. I know there are people that are much, much better at astrology than I am. And they would probably fill out this chart differently than I do. But you have to be yourself. You can't be somebody else. However, because it is the same reality that we are looking at, one would expect that the synthesis and summary chart would look pretty much the same because it is the same factor. same individuals you're working with. When you have filled out the whole left column, what you do is you go over this again and again, and you ponder each of those 8 components. And when you do that, you ask yourself questions. You ask, is this more important than that? And if it is more important, how much more important is it? We've got the biographical history from their lives, but this is still not an easy thing to do. We're weighing a character and all the parts of it. Now this is, by the time we get to this sheet, we can see it's quite reduced. But even though it's reduced, it is still very complicated. And it is still a very enormous thing. And there are all kinds of questions that you can ask yourself. If I get time, I'll write down or I'll jot down some of my questions that I asked in coming to the last column. Now, when you studied all of these and you have had intuitions about what is more important, and you have observations from the biographical informations, then you can form a judgment. And that judgment is what you put in the last column, which could be very narrow. And what I'm planning on doing in this will be as simple as can be. We give each of these factors a number from 1 to 10. You know, the modern thing, on the scale of 1 to 10. Some of the factors may have, you know, maybe 4 or 5 of them might be 7s, and 1 might be a 3 or something like that. But we're not doing this to produce the numbers. The numbers are mnemonics, so that you can remember what you have concluded when you have been tossing all of these things over and over in your consciousness. We're talking about saying, well, we spent 8 years on this. And so, so when we have that, then we begin to write. And we write a brief summary. I'm going to write a 1-page summary, and that's it. You write a brief summary, you try your own, and see what you come up versus with what I come out with. I'm sure Jerry may even do 2-page summaries.
It's been a long 8 years.
So that's what we're going to do. So each time for the next 8 meetings, though we may change in timing if it proves to be too difficult in one way or another, we're going to fill out a synthesis and summary chart for 2 individuals. And we're going to write a 1-page summary for 2 individuals. And then in the oral part, what we'll do is I'll talk about synthesis, things that synthetically came out in the process of doing this, or things that I found helpful in coming to the conclusions that I came to, so that you can try to do this on your own for yourself. I really encourage you to do it. It's a very hard thing, and don't be discouraged. But if you don't do the hard things now, when are you going to do them? It's a good time. You can share your results with the class if you would like. You don't have to. You can share them with me, and I'll duly laugh at them. But no. I'm almost always very encouraging. What's going on?
Oh, it's just banging. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. But at any rate, that's what we're going to do. And don't be hard on yourself, and please don't be hard on me. Because to try to whip these things out at the rate of 1 a week, 2 of them every 2 weeks, is not an easy thing to do. It's easy to sit and analyze and go into something and dig in, but to put it all together and come out with a good view of the character is not at all easy. So you can laugh at me. I don't mind it. That's as far as we're going to go tonight.
You feel all the resentment emanating towards you. What was no.
No, but can't you see that this is, and it's interesting, you're going to find it interesting, the difference between an astrological summary and a biography. A biography will only deal with the things on the surface and not all of those things that you don't see. And so it's going to be a different kind of a thing for yourself.
So we can choose anyone?
Well, we're going to start with Jay Gould and Helen Keller, and then we're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, as we do all the way through this, the same order we've been going all along. Okay, thank you very much.
So this we meet, when shall we all meet?
You actually
We meet
expect that
2
we
weeks.
Find those?
I
What's-
can find them, but I find all of them and then I sit there kind of awash